Gender in Biological, Social, and Political Contexts, presented by Dr. Nikki DiGregorio. This talk is the first in our Lenses of Gender series, which will continue each day this week through Friday. These lunchtime talks are part of the CCE's 2021-22 programming series, Understanding Gender, which also includes 2 exhibitions, one at the CCE, which is called The Glass Ceiling, that's curated by Ophelia Chambliss. It's a series of paintings, stories, testimonials, and spoken and written word pieces by women that address the issues of realizing, reaching, and breaking the glass ceiling to success in their careers and personal lives. This exhibition is on view at the CCE through May 31st. The other exhibition is entitled Engendered, and that is at Market View Arts. It features work by artists addressing gender identity in a variety of ways that includes examining their own relationship to establish gender norms and expectations, responding to the heteronormative male-female binary, and asserting queerness as a fluid alternative to the idea of a stable gender identity. And that is on exhibition through May 21st. At Market View Arts. So today, Nikki is with us. She is an associate professor at the School of Human Ecology at Georgia Southern University. She teaches courses in sexuality and diversity in human development, legal and public policies affecting families, and programming and evaluation for family services. Nikki's research focuses on the interplay between social policy, language, appropriation, and the experiences of gender and sexuality in diverse populations, as well as the scholarship of teaching, learning, as it pertains to pedagogy centered around diversity, value systems, sexualization, and objectification. So without further ado, we have Nikki with us today. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. That might be the best introduction that I've ever received. You just nailed it all. Really appreciate it. I don't see anyone with their cameras on eating yet, so I do know that this is a lunch and learn. So please, I hope most of you are doing that. I plan to do it shortly after this. So I'll be talking a little bit today with all of you about gender in different contexts, primarily biological, social, and political contexts, and how those tend to intersect and often conflate, quite frankly. So if we're looking at this in terms of what are we going to accomplish during this lunch and learn, we want to explore the concepts of gender, gender identity, and gender expression. We want to explore commonly utilized classifications or categories for sex and gender identities, explore intersectionality and its implications for gender diversity, examine the biological, social, and political aspects of gender, address the multiple functions and implications of gendered language in our lives, and as previously noted, enjoy lunch. Not necessarily in that order, it really depends on where you are, right? There are some things I'd like to do just in terms of baseline, just to make sure we're all on the same page, is to go over some vocabulary so you understand what I am saying, when I'm saying it, and what I'm implying by the language I'm using. So for our purposes, when we're referring to gender, we're really referring to the psychological, cultural, and behavioral traits that are associated with a particular sex based on time and location. The fluidity here is really important, and as well as considering that place and space piece in terms of how gender is received, interpreted, internalized, etc. Gender identity is referring to one's internal subjective sense of self, right? So in terms of each person's individual experience of gender, this can refer to everything and anything from the clothes they wear, the name they go by, their comportment, how they carry themselves, mannerisms, behaviors, how they talk, etc. Gender expression then refers to how an individual presents their gender publicly, right? So this will often reflect the person's gender identity, but not always, okay? A little bit more vocabulary for us. Most people identify with the gender that is most closely aligned to the sex that they were assigned at birth. This assignment is typically based on societal norms and ideas, and the term cisgender reflects this alignment, right? However, anatomical sex does not always correspond to gender identity. Oh, doesn't want to go, there it goes. Sex as a category is often assigned at birth, and it's usually based on the appearance of external anatomy, predominantly genitalia, and typically grouped as male, female, or intersex. And we're going to talk about sort of thinking about all of these things as being on spectrums and less about discrete categories, but we do have to work with the language that we are engaging with most of the time in other spheres, so we can all sort of come to some common ground. Intersex, if you're not already familiar, refers to individuals who have varied development of sexual characteristics. This can refer to excess chromosomes, fewer chromosomes, different combinations of chromosomes, differences in gonad development, or sex hormone amounts and exposure. The term transgender is a very broad and umbrella term that refers to people with diverse gender identities and expressions that differ from the sex they were assigned at birth. When you think about terms that are also used, you might have come across these, you might identify within some of these, different categories. When we talk about gender nonconforming individuals here, we're talking about individuals who do not subscribe to gender stereotypes that are associated typically with the sex that they were assigned at birth. They may or may not also identify as trans. Furthermore, terms such as non-binary or genderqueer can refer to a range of identities that are fluid and not exclusively masculine or feminine. You might be asking yourselves, why do we have all this language? It seems overly complicated. Overwhelmingly, there are two sex categories that are commonly acknowledged, right? And so I just want to go over, this is not a biology lecture, so sit tight if that's not your thing, but there is a bit of it. Some of the information that really is at the foundation for the genetic basis of sex determination. Most of us have been exposed to, well, we usually see this on restroom signs, right? This like antiquated image that's used symbolically to reflect somebody who is going to be perceived as or assumed to identify as a woman, right? So again, looking at this, we've all been taught that if you're looking at somebody who has developed as a typical female, we make assumptions based on their phenotype, meaning how they appear, right? And the observable characteristics they have. We make assumptions pretty erroneously about their chromosomes, right? We were taught XX chromosome, well, that's a female, right? That person's a woman. I know that just by looking at them, right? Or so we think. We also were taught on the other end of that, right? We've got the sex binary here, that typical males, well, we can assume that they have XY chromosomes internally. The thing that typically isn't taught is that it's a little bit more complicated to get typical male development. You have to have what's known as an active genetic sequence, which is referred to as the SRY gene. If you're curious, that's what that means. It means the sex determining region of the Y chromosome, okay? It has to be there, has to be on a Y chromosome, has to be active. Does that happen all the time? No, right? Development is super, super varied. And so what ends up happening is that we make all of these assumptions based on observable characteristics, but there are, whoops, sorry, I just got a new computer yesterday and it's throwing me for a little bit of a loop. There are all these different variations that are plausible, right? And that's one of the things that makes life pretty beautiful is that, there's so much variation that things would be really boring if we were all exactly the same. But on this big, big spectrum of sex, there are so many different variations that are possible. I mean, quite frankly, it's infinite when you really think about the way that genetics work. It is possible and also prevalent, right, for somebody who has two X chromosomes to appear phenotypically masculine based on our societal norms. So you're looking at somebody and you make assumptions based on these social norms and you would perceive that that individual must be male, but they may have two X chromosomes with an active SRY gene that's been translocated. Unless you have X-ray goggles, you would not know that, right? And so this is really where you really need to understand that, gender and sex are very complex concepts, but they are certainly not the same. Another variation that is something that has been well established in the literature. In fact, if you are looking to sort of like learn more about this, most people who study in this area and explore gender, sexuality, and sex know that there are at least 5 sex categories that are commonly acknowledged, not the sex binary, and that actually it's far more fluid than that. So we continue to kind of learn more as we learn more about each other. But this last individual on the far right of the screen has an X and a Y chromosome, but phenotypically may appear more feminized based on societal norms because they do not have, see that what I'm trying to do with this image is show you without the red, right? The SRY gene is inactive, it's missing, it's not present on that Y chromosome. And as a result, the body gets different messaging. So it can be really, really dangerous to sort of make these assumptions and just use these stereotypical pieces of observable information to infer things not just about sex, but also about gender. And that's sort of where we're headed. So gender is extremely complex, as I've already mentioned. It has a lot of biological components that are typically ignored. And so I want you to really move away from thinking about nature versus nurture and thinking about nature and nurture, which basically is how all of development works. You'd be really hard pressed to find a facet of development that was solely dependent upon one aspect of that particular equation. So in terms of biological predispositions, when you think about gender and one's gender development and one's expression, and everything from sort of, what sports one likes to play, if one likes to play sports, how competitive they are, what careers they pursue. There's a growing body of evidence. There are a lot of meta-analyses that have been done looking at prenatal hormone exposure. And so prenatal hormone exposure, I don't know about you, but when I was in the womb, I didn't have too much control over what was going on, right? I couldn't really say like, hey, this amniotic fluid's getting a little too androgen heavy. Could you please turn up something else? Like, I'd like a few more of these other hormones. Like, you don't really get to say much there, but we know that it plays a pretty important role in its intersection with the environment in terms of which genes you have and how they're expressed. So prenatal hormone exposure, there are these sensitive or critical periods when you're in the womb that, depending upon what that amniotic fluid looks like, if the person carrying you is exposed to certain types of stress, if the hormone levels change at those critical moments, it might be that those androgen washes actually change or shape a lot of the behavior you engage in as an adult while you were in the womb, right? That's pretty intense to think about. But again, these aren't directives, right? It's nature and nurture. And so prenatal hormone exposure is one where we've got a lot of evidence looking at this. We also know a lot about chromosomal anomalies, as I mentioned earlier. Some people might have some extra X chromosomes. There are actually chromosomes that are denoted by letters other than X and Y. And if you're interested in more of this, I encourage you to kind of explore some of the references I'll share with you at the end. But some people have a U chromosome or an O chromosome, right? It's like very, very diverse. But more directly, right? And I don't want, every time I do this in my classes, I have to preface it by saying, please, you really want to get this measured professionally, unless you have like a very distinct difference that you can observably see. I'll use my own hand for this, but there are anatomical markers that just talk about predispositions. These are not causal, but there have been many, many studies, meaning thousands at this point of studies, looking at the relationship between the length of one's pointer finger and the length of one's ring finger, and it's called the 2D/4D ratio, right? And so most people don't look at their hand and they're like, well, now I know a lot about, the predictors of my gender expression. It's not a 1-in-1 because it's nature and nurture, but it's pretty interesting to think about, right? So generally what these studies have found over time across populations is that, say we have someone who has developed as a typical male, if they have, an equal 2D or 4D ratio, they're more likely to have fertility issues, okay? They're more likely to be less aggressive than males that have a different 2D or 4D ratio, because it tends to be correlated to androgen exposure and testosterone levels later in life. I tend to fall over here when you start looking at my hand. I don't know if you should be able to see that, right? So my pointer finger is actually a bit shorter than my ring finger. My ring finger is pretty long. For somebody who identifies as a woman, who was assigned the sex category of female at birth, that is a low 2D to 4D ratio. It means that I'm more likely to have athletic skills. I'll tell you, I'm not that coordinated at this point in my life, but when I was younger, I was actually moving and grooving pretty well. There are a lot of other things that are correlated with that. And in terms of gender typical or gender atypical behavior, we can look to some of these biological predictors to help us understand gender diversity and to help us better support people who are gender diverse and perhaps aren't falling just concretely into the binaries that we have set up socially. When we look at social influences, though, that list, people are much more familiar with that list. You can think about the influences of your family. You can think about your peers. We're all familiar with gender stereotypes. The media is rife with them. You can analyze music lyrics. You can look at movie scripts. You can look at our conversations. If we just transcribe conversations with one another every day, you would see gender stereotypes, latent and some quite overt. The social and cultural norms that we have to support gender and gender expectations are pretty infinite, right? It doesn't discount the fact that this other empirical evidence exists shaping gender. In our society, gender is everywhere. You cannot get away from it, right? It influences every single thing we do. I was talking earlier about gender expression and talking about the clothes that people wear. We could also talk about the clothes that people don't wear, how much skin they reveal in a particular cultural setting, which parts of their body they reveal, right? How they walk and talk, different ideas about, what's appropriate and what's not. Even food, right? So it's the lunch and learn. I could ask you, right? And you say, even in 2022, if we're looking at societal level gender stereotypes, you could tell me if this steak is masculine or feminine. It is a steak, right? Similarly, you could do the same with a salad. And so it's really interesting to kind of think about that. I often will have my students look at inanimate objects, different types of furniture. Is this chair feminine or is this chair masculine, right? think about, I don't know if people still buy lazy boys anymore, but think about even just big old recliners, right? So it's sort of interesting to think about the language that we use to illustrate how pervasive gender actually is. But the assumptions that we make about gender extend beyond gender, right? We don't just stop there and say like, oh, okay, that person's masculine or feminine. Well, that's good to know. That's my observation about them. We make inferences about all kinds of aspects about people based on observational information. And so it all comes together and sort of shapes our ideas about other aspects of their lives, without even asking you for direct feedback. I know that implicitly your mind went elsewhere when I showed you images of these three individuals, right? You might be having thoughts about sexuality or sexual expression. You might be having thoughts about race or ethnicity or religiosity or social class, right? Like all of these things are coming together without anybody saying anything. And so when you start thinking about gender in all of these different contexts, it becomes really important for us to sort of take a step back and think like, well, where is that information coming from? We've identified that we're using stereotypes, right? And just as a refresher, I don't know how frequently you all kind of like get together and talk about what stereotypes are, but they really are widely held, relatively unfounded generalizations. They're somewhat fixed, they're overly simplistic, right? And they group things of people. And so what ends up happening is that as a society, we tend to rely far more on the social aspects of gender than on some of those biological predispositions I was talking about before. And it's not just at this point because people aren't always exposed to that information. It's because this is far more digestible. It's a lot easier to kind of think about things that make us comfortable, like the biases we have about what we should expect our daughters to do, or our sons to do, or our male identified partners to do. Like those are the types of things that make it sort of easier for our brains to kind of categorize people and retrieve information appropriately, and also retrieve information about our environment. But at the end of the day, it doesn't mean that it's a good decision or that it's a safe one for anybody else or for us. So when we start looking at identities more broadly, thinking about the images I just showed you of those three individuals, identities are interlocking and reinforcing. You don't get to just sort of hang your student or your professional hat on the coat rack when you walk in and completely forget all of the different implications of that identity when you go and engage with people in other spheres of your lives. And so what ends up happening there is that we see those identities intersecting as we engage with the world. And I like to kind of think about it as like this is a very food motivated talk, obviously, but I like to kind of consider, a very like moist, well-designed layer cake, where every layer would be very different if you were consuming it by itself, right? Like chocolate ganache is super different by itself. Icing by itself, I don't know, it's sort of its own thing, but it's not the same when you pair it with sort of like a decadent layer cake. Maybe you're adding things, and do you see what I'm saying? So like all these things are sort of shaping one another. And what ends up happening when we're looking at identities is that some identities carry privilege in our society, right? While others are going to be subjected to prejudice and discrimination. And that is often based on the stereotypes that we were just talking about, those like relatively simplistic, overgeneralized, fixed ideas about groups of people or individuals. In our culture, cisgender identities are heavily privileged. What ends up happening is that people who have an anatomical sex or a sex that was assigned at birth, right, that's in alignment with their gender identity, and even better, right, for them if it's in alignment with their gender expression, they're likely going to walk through the world really not having issues as it pertains to those particular sets of identities. Now, there might be an intersectional piece where other identities will be, prejudiced or discriminated against. But if we just focus on cisgender privilege right now, we can sort of see how that's maintained across our institutions and across our social norms. Intersectionality theory is a good lens for us to sort of unpack that and to kind of consider how we interact with one another and how we sort of engage with ourselves across these contexts, right? So Crenshaw notes that the process of formally recognizing as a social and systemic what was formerly perceived as an isolated individual is sort of like at the core of intersectionality, where you kind of look at how these things are really, really drawing upon one another, and that you really cannot extrapolate one from the other. It also encourages us as a theoretical perspective to look at those dynamics of difference and sameness, and to sort of recognize that ignoring differences within groups actually contributes to tension among groups. there's a lot of literature and evidence for the fact that there's more diversity within a particular social group than between groups. So there's so much strife and contention, when social identities have these ascribed norms and we say like, well, we're on this team, and these people are over here and they're just really different. And they're so different than us that, we are actually going to look to privilege our particular setting or status in society because we know that we're better than them. How do we know that? Well, society has sort of privileged this particular characteristic or whatever we tend to, in time and space, whatever is being privileged. And as a result, it contributes to that tension. But if you consider just looking among your own groups, right? So even if you just think of like a small community, right? If you think about like York, Pennsylvania, and you consider, is everybody in York, Pennsylvania exactly the same? Absolutely not, right? And then you just sort of get more micro about it and you consider, okay, well, so I identify as a woman. Are all women the same? No, right? If I ignore those within group differences, I'm really going to miss out on a lot, right? Because there's a lot of diversity there. And so it really is important for us to kind of think about this as we further unpack gender diversity and experiences that people have within different gender identities, because sometimes different forms of privilege can make it really, really difficult to see how the same tasks may be hard for some people. So I have some examples up there, like for instance, attending college or paying for meals. So you can kind of see that intersectional piece with different social identities, exercising, dating, or learning, right? All these things that many people take for granted. I do want to share with you some pretty recent statistics just to illustrate how important it is for us to take an intersectional lens to understanding gender diversity and to become more inclusive in our approaches across these contexts. A very recent US level national survey of transgender people found that almost 82% of participants reported seriously thinking about suicide, with almost 50% attempting suicide at least once. Now this juxtapose the overall, US population average, which tends to hover between 10 and 13%, is astounding. All of these numbers are high, right, for these particular things. But it's really important to kind of look at how maybe there's something to understanding gender diversity that might serve everybody better, and sort of help offset some of these challenges that certain aspects or certain people in our population experience. When you look at research on LGBTQ young adults, you find that they have 120% greater risk of experiencing homelessness compared to cisgender and heterosexual young adults. And this then increases again for LGBTQ young adults of color, right? So that intersectional compounding effect is really one that we want to take into consideration if we are looking to actually improve society for everybody. Last piece of information I want to provide for you in terms of thinking about this in a political context and also a social context. LGBTQ people experience very unique barriers when it comes to accessing food security, employment, transportation, and medical care. And again, this tends to be exacerbated for LGBTQ people of color. So thinking about this, knowledge and information around gender diversity can really help inform gender-specific policies, right? So what are social policies? Well, social policies are sets of standards and rules created by governing bodies or public officials to achieve specific outcomes regarding human welfare by guiding action and decision-making. That sounds lovely, okay? But a policy also can be a less formal mechanism. It can be unwritten, right? It can be something that is officially accepted. It can be a set of rules or ideas about what should be done, an idea or belief that guides the way you live or behave. We all have individual policies, right? We have this sort of like sense of how things should be or our beliefs about the way things should be done. And it becomes really, really important to consider how policies also intersect with time and place. Life course theory offers a really nice lens to kind of consider this, because if you think about all of us going through our lives in our little cohorts, right, if we just look at them as being almost age graded, it's not even just about place. It's also about all these other things intersecting and thinking about what you think is appropriate or how you think the world should be. At the end of the day, policymakers are individuals just like us, right? And so just as most of the general public won't have exposure to comprehensive information related to gender development, we can't really presume that policymakers would as well. And so as a result, sometimes, these things come together And they might actually be having unintended, well, we know they're having unintended consequences based on some of the data I just showed you, but they may even be having more so than we've actually been able to track at this point for people who are gender diverse and have other, social identities that perhaps are less visible or less supported by society, our institutions, and our policies. As a whole, we really have set up an array of rewards and punishments that influence our behavior, right? Specifically gender behavior. If you think about your own experiences, whether it have been when you were younger or even presently, because this doesn't stop, right? We do police and shape our gender behavior and gender performances every day for one another. There are a lot of rewards and punishments that are just set up. They're set up in society, right? If you perform well, you're going to be, you'll receive accolades, whether they be like actual palpable accolades or they be something that's sort of less formal. We have language that reinforces gender. For those of you that have studied the Romance languages, you know that items they're gendered. These items have actual la, un associated with them. English is interesting. It does not have an inclusive third pronoun, but that doesn't necessarily mean that language that is used or adopted by policies is uneventful or doesn't matter because our primary language doesn't support it. Language is shared. It's like a living, breathing organism. So what ends up happening is that when these policies become formalized, or when even those unwritten mechanisms, right, like say workplace policies, et cetera, use certain language, it tends to sort of snowball, right? So we can leverage that in the other direction to sort of be more inclusive, or we can use it to sort of marginalize or further marginalize people who are already less supported by social institutions and society in general. There are a lot of cis-normative assumptions in our language, and they're so prevalent, it's often really hard to recognize some of them. I'm trying to think of, the standard examples are things like people, something, being told sit like a lady, or, when you talk about mankind or manpower or things like that, like those are so embedded in our just cliched language that sometimes it's hard to kind of parse them out. But for people who might have gender identities or gender expressions that are more diverse than we typically are sort of exposed to, it can be quite difficult to sort of reconcile that and the misappropriation of language. The good news is that there's a lot of change that's been occurring with cultural and social norms, and it sort of illustrates, the expansion of language. It can expand and contract. And other languages have had many, many, many more examples of inclusivity since their origin, right? So for the past like 600-700 years, we've been seeing, a singular they throughout recorded history. And so it's not impossible to sort of have society expand a little bit to be more inclusive in this way, and to sort of lessen the punishments and maybe increase rewards for everybody so that they can express themselves in ways that are healthy across these contexts. And you might be thinking, like, what's in it for me at this point? Well, there's a lot of research that kind of looks at human diversity as being beneficial for everybody. It's not just about different social identities as the ones that we've talked about here. It also refers to diversity of thought. It's just good for us to be around diverse people. It actually makes us smarter. And one of the things that it does is it helps us sort of challenge the really, really worn neural pathways that we have, right? If you think the same way or think similar ways about things or people or groups of people, those stereotypes become so embedded, and that path becomes so worn in your mind, it becomes the easiest one to use, right? Instead of challenging it and sort of walking a different way, right? The grass isn't as worn down, so it becomes more difficult to take a different route. But your brain needs that sort of exercise as well. We also know, just if you're thinking just monetarily, gender diverse companies are going to outperform homogenous companies pretty significantly on a financial level. And what's coming back from some of the literature that's growing, thankfully, is that communication that consistently demonstrates inclusion is critical. It's critical for offsetting, some of the really staggering and upsetting statistics we looked at, but it's also critical for growth for everybody. And so one of the things that I want you to consider sort of as you continue through not just the series, but also just your own lives, is that, we have social institutions that are not structured to support diverse gender identities. We can consider adopting inclusive language as individuals. We can move to advocate for, policies in our organizations to adopt that. We can look to support people who are pressing against policies that are really, really problematic in terms of, being at the state level or even national level. And by recognizing the pervasiveness of gender, it gives us sort of a leg up in being able to kind of see those things and critique them and question those messages, not just messages from sort of the social context or political context, but also messages from our internal sense of self, where we just have those repeated messages coming at us, over the years, and sometimes they become almost reflexive. So it's really important to kind of have that ability to say, stop, okay, why am I thinking that? Why am I thinking that about that other person based on very limited data? It goes back to sort of what we did earlier in this conversation, where we were kind of looking at these little phenotypic outlines of people and making a lot of assumptions, not just about gender and gender identity and gender expression, but also about sex and sexual development. And in many cases, also extending to things such as, do they engage in, typically masculine activities or typically feminine activities? What are we looking at in terms of we make assumptions about their sexual behavior, which is really broad reaching, right? So gender becomes this really pervasive thing, and it's often conflated with sex. But as I hope I've illustrated in this brief conversation, that they are discrete concepts that actually interact with one another and interact with biology and the environment to sort of create all these different complex interactions within ourselves and within other people. And it's also really a good time to sort of take into consideration the really unique intersection of identities that everyone brings to the table. We do have a lot to learn from one another. And as I mentioned before, it would be really, really boring if we were all the same, and it just stands to reason for us to kind of keep on pressing to learn more so that we can do better for other people, but also selfishly do better for ourselves, I can only speak for myself, but I still give myself a pretty hard time, but it was a lot worse 10, 15 years ago. So I'm hoping to kind of continue on that upward trend and to just move towards self-acceptance while also accepting other people, because I think that that's probably in everybody's best interest. Here are the things that I drew upon primarily, right? So for some of the statistics, I tried to stick to things that have been published quite recently. Not that I necessarily think that, if I had cited anything for 2017, things would be that different, but actually the more recent data are actually a little bit more depressing, to be honest with you. But I think it's important to be in the know about what this is doing for people and why it's so important to have a more nuanced and comprehensive understanding of gender so that we can help educate others and hopefully sort of intercept some of these problematic correlations and just make the world hopefully a better place. And that's what I have. I went a little faster than I wanted to, but that's how that goes sometimes. But I'm also more than willing to answer questions, to talk, to reflect, and I really appreciate your time and energy as I learn this this new iMac. But I'll stop sharing so I can see everybody. All right.
Does anyone have any questions for Nikki? Feel free to drop them in the chat or unmute and share yourself. All right.
Does anybody want to talk about what they had for lunch? At least, is anybody actually eating during this?
The picture of your cake was outstanding.
I will tell you, and I know that you know that I do bake. I did not make that cake. I could have posted a picture of one, but that was not my image. Yeah. Yeah, Cherish, that's great in the chat. The 2D/40 ratio, yeah, is something that comes up a lot in my sexuality class. And there's a lot more I could have said. I was nervous about time and then ended up getting a little bit ahead of myself. But it's really an interesting area of research, because when you start thinking about that and you think about something as seemingly innocuous as finger length, and then you start looking at they've done longitudinal studies on that. Where they'll look at the 2D/40 ratio and they'll study people over very long periods of time. And there are correlations. Remember, correlations, not causality. I don't want anybody running out of here saying like, Nikki said, I'm going to end up doing blank. I have no idea what you're going to end up doing. But there are correlations to everything from, if you become a financial trader, right? How much money you'll earn, juxtapose people in a similar sex category with a different 2D/4D ratio, or how many sexual partners you'll have, or if you will develop an eating disorder, or if you're more likely to develop different types of cancer, right? Like there are all these different things, but there are a lot of them that are very specific to gendered behaviors, sports, you know, career professions. Sexual activity is absolutely one that's gendered, right? I mentioned sexual partners. So it's really kind of interesting to think about those correlations and with respect to just, you know, one's hand. But there are like very nuanced ways to go about, you can have them professionally measured, because for most people, the distance is far closer than mine. I just have a very large difference between that, so that the ratio is low and it's easy to illustrate. But for most people, their fingers are a little closer in length.
I have a question. So you talked about how even like in the womb, there are biological factors that can contribute to gender. And I was wondering if in your research, do you know, like at what age do children start becoming aware, like socially from like interactions with other people? Do they start forming a concept of like gender and their own gender? And
super early. Yeah. So that was sort of like a multi-part question. So the prenatal stuff, you know, that's happening. I don't think it's like a Look Who's Talking, you know, I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, but it's not like that, where, you know, in the womb, or, you know, the sperm are swimming around, they're like, I'm gonna get in there and somebody's gonna have a lot of androgens. Like, that's not what's happening. But in the womb, it's like things are changing all the time, right? So if someone who's pregnant is exposed to stress, as I mentioned before, just briefly, but you know, it could be environmental stress in the form of, you know, if you go and you say I get a coffee every day at the gas station, and I love this coffee because it's so hot, I just want it to burn my throat and warm me up really fast, but it comes in this cheap plastic cup and I'm drinking right out of that lid, and all that heat's getting in there and I'm drinking that. Like, there are some studies that indicate that if I become pregnant and I keep doing that, that even those compounds that have changed could actually create an environmental stressor in the womb, because it's not natural to consume plastic, even though we have microplastics in us at this point from all different kinds of things. It could also be that maybe if I become pregnant, I have consumed, you know, there are a lot of studies looking at different levels of vitamins and what that can do to ones, like just excessive vitamin A can help with cramps in the myometrium, right? But if you become pregnant and you're somebody that doesn't realize that that can actually offset your hormone levels, it can have an influence if it's at that critical period. It's the same thing for people with sperm, right? Looking at some of this, they didn't know that DDT, they were spraying for so many years, spraying fields with people who were working in agriculture, and it was actually doing a number on sperm count. So environmental factors can be outside, but it can also be psychological stress and things like that. So all that's going to shape things later in the form of predispositions. Like, you know, I'm trying to come up with a better analogy in my head, because when you started talking, I was like, don't say minefield, but I'm just going to say it, because minefields have this negative connotation. You don't want to step on a mine, but just think about all these different possibilities, right? It's almost like we have all these potentialities genetically. All of your genes won't be expressed. In fact, about 25% of your genetic makeup will change over the course of your life due to things like external stressors. So you're constantly in flux. It's not that all of your genes are just going to get up one day and be like, we're not doing this anymore, we're going to change our order around. But there are small changes that occur over time. And so those types of differences early on, and in terms of what's expressed, can be shaped by your environment, right? Like if you're in an environment that represses your gender expression, right, you're less likely to cultivate those skills. If I had grown up in a household where my parents were like, no, you're not going to play that sport, right? We want you to do ballet or something. Then I wouldn't have developed, like, you know, jumping capabilities, or do you see what I'm saying? So like, that's one aspect of it. In terms of the young child thing, that starts so early. You know, there are studies indicating that as early as infancy, like 6 months, you know, infants are able to identify voices that are deeper and faces that are more masculinized versus those that are on the other end of the spectrum. They're not thinking, at least I don't know that I don't presume that they are. They're not thinking like, oh, that's a man's voice, right? Like I'll put that over here. They just recognize that difference. And then it is socialized to be, okay, this is on this side of the spectrum. And most people who are going to be identified as men or males are going to have deeper voices, right? And then you get a curveball like me. And, you know, I remember the one Thanksgiving dinner where my nephew turned to my parents and my older sister and said, is Auntie Nikki a boy, right? Fair enough, right? Because like I'm giving him mixed messages based on social indicators big time, right? My hair is short, I'm pretty androgynous, my voice is really deep. I mean, I just didn't pick up a phone forever because I just, every time I was like, hello, sir, right? So kids start really early, and then we have these social norms that like perpetuate that. By the age of 3 or 4, though, children develop what's referred to as gender constancy. And here's another conflation of gender and sex, where by the age of 3 or 4, if you have a man, a cisgender man who puts a wig on his head, a 2-year-old's going to look at that person and think it's a woman in our society, right? That 2-year-old most of the time is going to look at that person and be like, oh, that person was a man yesterday, but today now they're a woman because they have long hair, and that's how I'm doing this. They categorize themselves similarly, right? But by 3 or 4, they recognize that sex categories are relatively permanent. You can dress up a particular way, but it doesn't necessarily change who you are. And that really starts cultivating this like gender identity piece. Now, whether or not that's expressed depends a lot on the environment, right? Are there rewards and punishments in place there? You know, we have a lab school here. I remember a few years ago, and I'm sure it happens more often than when it trickles down to my building, but there were some parents who were really upset because, you know, do you want your son to wear dresses when they play, right? Because that's an option there. They have dresses. If the kids put them on, what are they going to do? Some people want control over that remotely, and they want to say, I don't want my son doing that. That's what I'm getting at in terms of like predispositions that are shaped by the environment. But yeah, kids know really early on, a lot earlier than we give them credit for, to be honest with you, because and it makes sense because their brains are trying to do the same thing that we do in adulthood with the retrieval. Where are the stereotypes? What can I sort of clump together? Most of the time, people who behave, sound, look, act this way are going to be here. And then most of the time, right? And then you have people that are sort of all over the place, and it can cause some confusion. That confusion doesn't necessarily come from the difference. It comes from our society, or in my case, my family's inability to respond to that in a way that was effective. And that's where the language becomes really important too, right? Oh, I do see there's a question in the chat. You briefly mentioned there being 5 sexes instead of the typical binary view. Could you speak more to this? Absolutely, yeah. Dr. Ann Fausto-Sterling's work, let me put that in the chat too. She is and has been sort of at the forefront of all of this for many years, and had to really fight to get this to be recognized. But now, thankfully, there are many other researchers looking at this. There are just far more combinations possible than XX and XY. Just as I illustrated, right, with that brief visual, they're somewhat infinite. There are all different kinds of conditions. You know, if this were sort of like a very long biology-driven lecture series, we could sort of go into that. But to answer your question briefly, you know, the idea here is, okay, it's not just about chromosomal anomalies. We know it's also about sex hormones. We also know that it's about whether or not certain genes are active, right? You can have certain gene sequences. You can have an SRY region that's not active, right? Think about genes as being somewhat dormant, right? You have to sort of, it's almost like a light dimmer. You can have the light on really, really low, or it can be on really, really high, but you still have the same light switch right there, right? Genes function the same way. And when you look at studies around sex and sexuality, you're going to see that people are going to acknowledge generally at least 5 sexes, because in terms of prevalence and being able to identify individuals with these conditions across time and space, it's been justified that there are at least 5 categories. Now, there are definitely, you know, it's hard to even talk about categories. There are a lot of other examples in between. I'll give you an example. So one of the conditions that is often identified is 5-alpha reductase deficiency. All right, so they all have these like long-winded names, or they have somebody's last name. A lot of times researchers like to name things after themselves. This one is not named after anybody. It's actually referring to individuals who are born. They are born with genitalia, external genitalia that appears feminized, right? Meaning there aren't any visible, there isn't a visible scrotum, typically. There isn't any visible testy material, anything like that. And the penile tissue is very, very small, and it is mistaken often, right, as an elongated clitoris, okay? When those individuals hit puberty, they're actually XY. They just didn't have, that's why it's called 5-alpha reductase deficiency. They don't have the capability at that point in their lives to convert testosterone to DHT, which is like the super potent version of testosterone. They can't do that as infants, right? So they're born, look at the genitals, right? And it's like, congratulations, it's up, right? Lo and behold, individuals hit puberty. Okay, what ends up happening? Their testes descend because they hit puberty, and all of a sudden there's this wash of testosterone, right? Hormone levels change so dramatically, a wash of testosterone, testes descend, penis grows. All of a sudden, individuals who have been socialized and living as, in most cases, young girls, right, as females, are now in a situation where their bodies have changed really dramatically. And in the Dominican Republic, because the population's so small there, have elucidated is, look, in places where these populations are small, their genetic pool is smaller, right? And it's more condensed, meaning the prevalence of these conditions is far greater than we see in much larger populations like the United States, where you've got 330 million people, okay? Or in, say, China or India. So in the Dominican Republic, it's far more common for people to hit puberty and change their names, change their pronouns, and say, hey, I actually identify this way now, because conditions like this are more common and there's more knowledge about them. So when you look at the United States, there are many, many intersex people in the United States. Many people may technically be intersex by definition and not know that they have chromosomal anomalies. Usually it comes up at puberty or when there are health issues, because oftentimes these people who are part of sex categories other than male or female, somewhere in the middle, they might have sort of different combinations of gonads or sex hormones, et cetera. And you know, they might be trying to reproduce. That's often another point where it comes up. And, you know, medically, we have to recognize this variation in the same way that we would recognize any other form of diversity. It's just taken so long here because we have a very hard time talking about variations with sex and gender in our culture. I hope I answered that question. It's hard to answer that question without going into too much detail, but yeah, I mean, Ann Foster Sterling's work will definitely help in that area. But yeah, there are generally at least 5 sexes recognized in the literature.
Any final questions before we wrap up today? All right, well, thank you so much, Nikki. This was wonderful and very informative. And I'd like to thank Cherish, Christopher, and Rebecca Eyre from our office who helped put this all together. I did just drop the link for the rest of our series in the chat. So if you aren't registered for those events, I definitely encourage you to do that. And stay tuned for more events at the CCE. Thanks for joining this weekend, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks for your time. Thanks for having me.